So this is a course about alternatives in a world that is famished for lack of them. A characteristic of the present time is that there seem to be no alternatives. If by alternatives we mean structural alternatives, alternatives that have to do with the organization of social life, the institutional structure of society, and the ideological assumptions associated with them. And because this is the situation and the difficulty with which we contend, I want to begin with the subject of what you might call programmatic aphasia, our difficulty of thinking and arguing programmatically, that is to say, about alternatives. If I propose to you something that may seem interesting, but is very close to what already exists, you're likely to say, in the current climate of opinion, well, that's certainly feasible, but it's trivial. If, on the other hand, I propose to you something that's distant from what exists, but may seem interesting as a speculative possibility, you're likely to say, that's interesting, but it's utopian. And so it happens that in the current climate of opinion in the world, almost anything that can be proposed is likely to seem either trivial or utopian. Now, this dilemma, I want to say first, is a false dilemma, which results from an assumption that alternatives are like blueprints. They're interesting if they're far away, and they're trivial if they're close by. But a programmatic alternative, and certainly the programmatic alternatives that we'll be discussing here, are not to be seen as blueprints. They're not like architecture, they're like music. They're about a succession of steps. And any alternative worth thinking about can be described at points that are relatively close to what exists or relatively far away. What matters in a programmatic alternative is first that it mark a direction that can be explored either close or far away. And second, that it select in the immediate circumstance, historical or national, the initial steps by which to begin to move in that direction. So this dilemma, I want to argue in the first place, is a false dilemma, which arises from a misunderstanding of the nature of a programmatic argument. Every programmatic argument worth thinking about can be explored at points that are relatively close or far away. Now, here in this classroom, we're not in the setting of real politics. And therefore, I think we should seek to have the advantages of our disadvantages. The setting here is intellectual. It's ideas about alternatives. And my general tendency in our programmatic argument will be to choose to describe alternatives at an intermediate point, neither very close to what already exists and therefore appearing to be trivial, nor very far away and therefore appearing to be utopian. The reason to prefer this intermediate position, neither close nor far away, is that it characteristically lends itself to conceptual clarification. And here we are in an academic setting, and therefore what we should seek above all is clarity. But the positions described at this intermediate place, neither very close nor far away, have a disadvantage, which is that they're likely to seem too close to arouse enthusiasm, but not close enough to be immediately feasible. And that is why in practical politics, in any nation in the world, when we are engaged in an attempt to transform the structure, we characteristically prefer to combine the very close and the very far away. The discourse of transformative politics is characteristically a combination of the very practical and of the visionary. And the task of the political prophet is to suggest the first steps, the installments of a larger promise, combining the proximate and the visionary in the same discourse, but at a cost for our purposes here, which is the cost of conceptual clarity, which in this circumstance, I believe, we must value above all. But I want you to understand that this is a choice, and that this is not the correct way to think of programmatic alternatives in general. I will tend to emphasize the middle distance, the intermediate place, but you must correct in your minds, you must adjust for this preference, understanding that if an alternative is worth thinking about at all, it should be possible to explore it simultaneously at all points of proximity to the existent. Now, let me say one more thing before I set aside this discussion of the difficulties of programmatic argument in this period of programmatic aphasia. An additional difficulty that we have is intellectual. The main set of ideas which has influenced in recent centuries, in the recent time, those who seek a transformation of social life, is the tradition that comes from classical European social theory. And in particular, from the doctrines of Karl Marx. And this is a tradition that emphasizes the vital importance of structural change. change in the basic institutional arrangements of society and in the ideological assumptions related to them. Marxist social theory is in some respects the consummate achievement of classical European social theory and became the main body of ideas influencing the left, the progressives in modern history. And it has an immense advantage over the ordinary ideas of contemporary social science, which is that it is anchored in a structural view. It follows the main line of political thought since Aristotle, which is to emphasize the basic regimes of society. Marx called these regimes the modes of production: feudalism, capitalism, and then socialism. And this is the main apparatus of ideas that the progressives in modern history have. Now, there is a problem with these ideas. The problem is that they have become literally incredible, in the sense that almost no one really believes in them. But they stand in their present form as a proxy for the ideas in which we might believe, because they are the only fully developed and tangible example that we have of a structural view. So let me briefly state why they have become unbelievable. They have become unbelievable because they combine in themselves something that is good and something that is bad. What is good is the emphasis on structure. When politics is serious, it is about the regime, the structure, the basic assumptions. When it is serious intellectually, it is a doctrine of structure and structural change. And when it is serious practically, in practical politics, it is the supreme object of ambition in political life. The object of ambition is to preserve or transform the structure. Everything else is secondary. Now, one way of discerning the central idea in this tradition of classical European social theory is that it wants to affirm that the structures of social life, these regimes, which are, as it were, the fate of the societies, are a kind of frozen politics. They're not like the atomic structure of a natural object. They are the congealed form of what? Of us. In the late 18th century, Vico, an Italian philosopher, said, we can understand the regimes because we made them. We understand them from within, not in the way that we understand externally a natural object, a phenomenon, but internally, as the creator understands his creation. So you could say politics, the struggles of social life, are like a game of musical chairs. There's incessant fighting, practical struggle, and visionary struggle over the terms of social life, which are the terms of our access to one another, practically the command of human labor, and emotionally. And then from time to time, this struggle, this incessant struggle in history, stops. It doesn't ever stop completely. It stops temporarily or relatively. And then everyone sits down on the chairs, and the chairs are the structures. So the regimes of social life are the residue, the crystallized residue of this struggle that takes place in social life. Nothing there is natural. And we shouldn't understand it in the way in which we understand a natural phenomenon, like the atomic structure of an object in nature. Because these structures are nothing but us. They are us, congealed. This was the revolutionary insight of classical social theory, which stands in opposition to almost everything that came after, and in particular to the dominant temper of the positive social sciences. But it has a disadvantage or a defect, which is that in classical social theory, this revolutionary insight into the nature of social structures, namely that we made them, that they're just us, that they're not objects in nature different from us, this revolutionary insight was compromised and corrupted by a series of illusions that we might call the illusions of false necessity. The first of these illusions is that there is a short list, a menu of basic regimes in social life. For Marx, these are the modes of production, of which capitalism is one and socialism would be another. And the truth seems to be that there is no such short list. The second assumption is that each of these regimes, the structures, the modes of production, is indivisible. In other words, if it is to change, it changes ultimately all at once and radically. From this idea of the indivisibility of the structures, there results a binary idea of politics. All politics is either the reformist management of a structure, like capitalism, or it is the revolutionary substitution of one structure by another. So one thing is to manage capitalism, to take the example of Marx's view of structure. Another thing is to replace it. And there is a fundamental difference between reformism and revolution. Now it seems that things aren't like that. And that real structural change, when it happens in history, is almost always fragmentary and can become revolutionary in outcome if it persists in a certain direction under a certain conception. And so this has a momentous practical consequence in contemporary history. Many of the people who govern countries in the world are ex-Marxists. And the way they think is real change would be revolution. Now, unfortunately, that's not feasible in our historical circumstance. Or if it were feasible, it would be too dangerous. So what's left for us to do then is to humanize the existing order. For example, by compensatory redistribution or by regulation of the market. And we have to wait for the favorable historical circumstance in which real transformation could take place. Thus, the ex-Marxist becomes a disillusioned social democrat. And many of the people who govern countries in the world are exactly that. The idea of revolution, the idea of this total change, is thus turned upside down and converted into its opposite. It becomes an alibi for political prostration. And under the influence of this illusion, the progressives often appear on the stage of contemporary history as the humanizers of the inevitable. They appear as the sugar coaters. Their task is to distribute the sugar, to humanize an order which they see no way to replace. Now, nevertheless, the vocabulary of the Marxist theory continues to be used. The concepts of capitalism, this particular view of class conflict, but used by people who no longer literally believe in it. And the difficulty of using this theoretical apparatus to understand the historical events is dealt with by dilution rather than by intellectual transformation. So we think, well, these ideas are more or less correct, but they're exaggerated. For example, we emphasize the relative autonomy of culture or the relative autonomy of politics. We dilute the theory rather than replacing it. Now, the consequence of this intellectual situation, the large consequence, which I have just described by emphasizing Marxism. The consequence is that we have no credible way of thinking about structure. So an alternative to conventional social science would have to be a way of thinking about the structures, the regimes, what they're like, how they're composed, how they change. And after all, in every department of thought, the essential point is transformation. The only way to understand any phenomenon in society or in nature is to grasp how it could be changed. If we don't understand the accessible transformations of a phenomenon, we don't understand it altogether. We just stare at it. Every conception of a natural or social phenomenon, every insight into its nature depends on a view of its accessible transformations, the theirs to which we can get from here. So this is a formidable obstacle in our thinking about society and its transformation. And it helps explain the tenacity, the power of that difficulty that we have in imagining alternatives. It's not just this confusion about some things being utopian and others appearing to be trivial. It's the particular nature of our difficulty in imagining the transformation of the structures of social life. Now let me stop there for a moment and ask for your comments or questions about these initial propositions. Do you see what I'm trying to evoke? What I'm trying to evoke is the roots of this confusion that we have, this paralysis of the programmatic imagination. It's something particular to the career of social thought. It could easily be confused with a more general phenomenon in thought. Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher, said, "Only a brief moment of celebration is allowed to truth during the too long periods in which it is first dismissed as paradoxical and later derided as obvious." So it has something of the feature of that problem, but it's much more specific because it's about the particulars of our ability to imagine regimes and their transformation. Yes?
I'm curious if you can go a little more into the intellectual.
Can you use your microphone in front of you while you're speaking?
Okay. I'm curious if you can elaborate a little more on the intellectual aspect that you were talking about, particularly, the follies that we're seeing regimes as indivisible, and in fact they're just like a haphazard collection of systems and institutions. The ways in which intellectualism often seems to be a sort of gatekeeping tool rather than something that can aid everyday people in understanding and transforming the small elements of the regime that are around them. I'm curious for your thoughts on that, and if you could, just dive a little bit more into the role of intellectualism,
Well,
please.
let me be sure I understand what you're asking about. So, contemporary social science, let's say, it has, or more generally, the departments studied in the academy, the divisions of knowledge. There are the positive social sciences, of which the most influential and powerful is economics. And it seems that each of them naturalizes the existing form of social life. Each of them, as it were, rationalizes and naturalizes, but each does it in a different way. So like Tolstoy says at the beginning of Anna Karenina, all happy families are alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And the different ways in which the positive social sciences sever insight into the actual from imagination of the possible are the peculiar forms of each social science's unhappiness. But it seems to be the overriding characteristic of the social sciences. The epistemological complaint, the challenge to that is that that's not thinking. Insight is always insight into transformation. And that if we have a form of thought which seduces us into thinking that what exists is natural, we don't understand that. Then in the normative disciplines of political philosophy and legal thought, what we have is the humanization of society. So the main currents of thought in these disciplines are ideas like the theories of justice in political philosophy, or the idealization of law in the vocabulary of policy and principle in legal thought, which want to make it appear that the societies in which we live are systems, and systems that are in the service of an ideal. You know, it's a system of policies and principles, which is the law of the regulated market economy established in the mid-20th century. Or in the theories of justice, pseudo-philosophical props to the homely practices of ameliorative redistribution under institutionally conservative social democracy. So they seem very abstract, like the Rawlsian theory of justice. It's radically egalitarian. But the pragmatic residue is really the attempt to justify compensatory redistribution in a society in which the structure is not challenged. And then the third element in this spiritual life is in the humanities. Consciousness embarks on a roller coaster of subjective adventurism, completely disassociated from the understanding of practical social life, which is what Karl Marx would say. And so we have the rationalizing tendencies in the positive social sciences, the humanizing tendencies in the normative disciplines, and the escapist tendencies in the humanities. That's the sum of our intellectual life in engagement with the structures. And on the other hand, we have this old classical social theory, which is about structures, but which seems to be infected or contaminated by a series of illusions. It has this revolutionary insight at its basis. The structures are us, we made them. They're this kind of frozen fighting. But all of this is corrupted. So all of that is just by way of understanding how difficult the situation is. And because we couldn't fundamentally progress without having some insight, and especially insight in the service of the imagination of transformation. That's all what I'm trying to compact into this discussion. And so, for example, if you go back to those illusions of false necessity to which I was alluding, see, there's the menu, the basic forms of regimes. There's the binary idea of politics that comes from the thesis of indivisibility. And then there's the third element, which is the idea that we can't have a program. The reason why we can't have a program, ultimately, is that that would be what they call voluntarism. Because history has a program for us. And if we attempt simply to invent a direction, our voluntarism will fail or collapse, and the sign or the price of that will be political defeat. So there we are. So I'm trying to prevent a completely relentless, unsparing account of the situation, so that we understand that this isn't simply some kind of patchwork that we could come up with later, but this is a formidable enigma in which our practical and transformative ambitions are connected to these intellectual ambitions. Comments? Yes.
Professor, without being too trite, many of the revolutionaries of the 20th century and the great Marxists that you spoke of in previous generations also felt it necessary to adapt their own systems to the material conditions.
Also, could you say that?
Felt it necessary to adapt their own systems, the revolutions that they championed, to the material conditions of their own countries. For instance, Thomas Sankara did not think of himself as an orthodox industrialist Marxist. Without being too trite about the whole thing, it seems to me what you're describing is the synthesis at the end of a very long dialectical clash between systems. Doesn't it make sense that the theory is necessarily diluted in the end product?
Well, the systems, so we're now in this period of the 21st century, having gone through these disasters of the 21st century, right? Of the 20th century, in which there were these big ideological systems and pretensions. There was Bolshevism, there was fascism and Nazism. There was this class of large-scale systems. So the vocabulary of all of that hangs around, right? The vocabulary doesn't disappear. And so there's still these doctrines that are described under these labels. There's socialism, there's this, there's that. But it's all a little bit false, it seems, because that's no longer the reality. The reality is, the basic reality seems to be this reality of no alternatives. You look around the world, what are the alternatives? So in the rich countries of the North Atlantic region, there's this regulated market economy. Which is now facing a particular problem. The particular problem is that the most advanced practice of production until the present time was industrial mass production, sometimes called Fordism, Fordist mass production. And it's falling apart all over the world. It's being replaced by another advanced form of production, which we sometimes call the knowledge economy, and which is not restricted to manufacturing. It exists in every department of the economy. However, in each department of the economy, it exists only in an insular form, as an island or an archipelago of islands, excluding the majority of the population, even in the most advanced economies in the world with the most educated populations. So the alternative, the successor to mass production, up to now, seems to be an insular, socially exclusive form of the knowledge economy. And if you project into the future its consequences, what it seems to be is that An elite of entrepreneurs, of inventors and disruptors is in the control of this vanguard, and everyone else in the society, exaggerating, is relegated to some form of make work. If they're not providing some service to this elite, right? So alternatives of the kind that we're looking for in this discussion have to be alternatives that deal with realities like that. And we need then a body of ideas appropriate to that task. So that's the difficulty that I'm trying to evoke now at the beginning of the discussion. Any further comments?
You mentioned this problem of dilution. Would you locate an original sin or a originary moment for this problem, or was that?
I'm sorry.
You mentioned the problem of dilution.
Are you using your mic?
Yes.
Okay.
Dilution, the problem you mentioned, that every political philosophy, especially like the socialist ideals we see, are being diluted. Where do you locate the market? Like, when did that start? And like, what was the driver?
I can't. I'm having trouble. Say it again.
Where do you locate the original issue with dilution? Like, where does this dilution come from? Why did it start?
What's the it that's what?
Dilution.
You mean now you're talking about the dilution of Marxism? Because there's a contradiction in the theory. The theory was a theory that says it's all politics. It's all fighting. The structures of social life are this frozen fighting. But then it turns out that in fact there's this rigid framework imposed on the frozen conflict, which are these illusions of false necessity. There's this menu of regimes, each of them is indivisible, and then there's a science of the laws governing the foreordained succession of the regimes in history. The original defect to which I'm pointing is the contradiction between the idea that there's no natural structure. There are constraints imposed by history, but they're not the constraints that can be described by this apparatus of ideas, of the thesis of the short list, of the indivisibility, the science of laws. All of that is false, I'm saying. But I'm also making an empirical comment, which is that almost no one believes in it. It's become impossible to believe in its original form. That's the claim. And so the vocabulary survives the death of the theory. The vocabulary continues, but the theory in the context of which the vocabulary acquires meaning has already been rejected. And so the confusion grows. Now, in this circumstance, the circumstance I'm arguing of the progressives, in which the intellectual instruments for understanding the transformation of society aren't there, or they're there in this corrupted form, this confused form. The progressives or the left suffer from a series of forms of disorientation or difficulty. So I want to say, first, they have no clear project. Because what is their project? Their project used to be the state control or state command of the economy. Now, that's become difficult to accept as the axis. And what would be the alternative? The alternative seems to be the improvement of the market order by regulation and compensatory redistribution. So the progressives appear on the stage of contemporary history as the humanizers of the inevitable. The inevitable being the market order in its contemporary form. And they're the sugar coders. They distribute the sugar. If you ask them, what's their program? Their program is the program of their conservative adversaries with a humanizing discount. So, of course, there's a problem, and this is also a practical problem in politics, which is that the force that commands the agenda is the force that most credibly embodies the cause of creation, of invention. Not just the one that says, I'll preserve your impulse, but I'll humanize it. So it's a losing position in politics to just be the humanizer. The progressives would have to have a productivist project, not just a distributivist project. A project about the organization of invention, of disruption, of enterprise in some radically different form, which is what they appear not to have. So statism seems to be too much. But the mere improvement of the market order through regulation and redistribution seems to be too little. And what then is their project? So you could say, for example, their project might be to take the knowledge economy, which now exists only in an insular and socially exclusive form, and take the set of initiatives that step by step would transform this knowledge economy for the few into a knowledge economy for the many. That would be an example of a productivist project. But that would only make sense if it were part of something larger. So they have no project, basically, is the first claim. In the United States, it has often seemed that the leaders of the party of the progressives, the Democratic Party, have as their project to make the United States more like the Sweden of the 1970s. Now, I'll say frankly, I think that's an absurd project, but that's been much of their project, meaning we want entitlements that would humanize this market order, which is called by some capitalism. Now notice right there in this little exchange, the confusion. So the thesis of the right is the market order has an objective structure. So there is one market order, basically. It's not something that we invent or reinvent. If Robinson Crusoe trades long enough on his island, he will eventually reproduce the whole system of German private law. Because implicit in the practice of free exchange, there's a whole institutional logic, spontaneous order of coordination. Actually, most of legal theory in the 150 years from the middle of the 19th century to the end of the 20th was a systematic demolition of that proposition. And not by radicals, but by people like Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who demonstrated that the market order has no natural logic. And as you go down the ladder of more and more concrete propositions, you can't resolve the different possible ways in which it could go by inferring the answer back to the abstract conceptions of the market, deducing the answers from free contract or private property. The answer is going to turn, they said, on conflicts of interest and of vision. It's going to be practical and contextual. And then there's the Marxist view, which is there's capitalism. And capitalism has a logic. It's a regime. So the Hayekian view, Hayek's view, market fundamentalism, and the Marxist view are fundamentally similar in this respect, because they both begin and end in the proposition that the market economy is a thing. It has a logic, it has a structure implicit in it, but we don't invent, that we discover. And that's then part of the atmosphere of the intellectual confusion in which this debate or non-debate about the alternative takes place. So first, there's no project, clear project, other than to humanize the market order in its present form, and then claim either that it is the natural market order or that it is capitalism, and that capitalism has an inherent structure. Second, there's no way of thinking about the regime and its transformation. And that's the debate we were having a moment ago. What was the way of thinking? The way of thinking was Marxism, or some equivalent to it, which took the revolutionary insight, Vico's insight, and surrounded it with these constraints. Now, third, there's no social base. There's no clear constituency. What was the social base of the left-leaning parties in the West? The social base was the organized labor movement headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy, especially conventional industry. That was the social base. Now, this social base is no longer credibly seen as the embodiment of the universal interests of humanity. It is increasingly seen and ultimately comes to see itself as just one more interest group with factional interests. And what is the real social base that is emerging in the world, all over the world? In the whole world, most people remain poor. Even in the United States, most people are basically poor. Most Americans don't have $500 on which they can draw in an emergency. They have nothing. The effective rate of saving in the country is close to zero. But most people in the world, although they are poor and disorganized, if not absolutely poor, then relatively poor, have petty bourgeois aspirations. So what do most people in the world want? What is the object of their ambition? Most people in the world, even when they are poor, want to have a little farm or a store, a shop in town, in the city, or some trade for which they can charge a fee. So the universal object of aspiration is old-fashioned, relatively unproductive family business sustained by self-exploitation and family saving. Self-exploitation meaning you work day and night. So if there's going to be a base for the relative, for the project, which the progressives are lacking, the base has to communicate with that reality, because that's what most people want. Their aspiration is not a proletarian aspiration, organized labor, militant in these organizations. That's a rump, a residue. That's not the real situation. And finally, so I said there's no project, there's no way of thinking, there's no social base, because there would be a social base of this, but they have to create it. So how could that base become the real base of an alternative? Well, all the societies that exist in the world are class societies. So there's not going to be an alternative unless the asset-holding classes, unless the elites share somehow in the creation of the alternative. So in most countries in the world, the dominant element in the asset-holding class is some form of rentiers. And of course, financial rentiers are the most common, but there are rentiers on natural resources too of different kinds. So in order for there to be a growth miracle that would create a favorable climate for making an alternative, there has to be a division in the elites. And there has to arise in the country a productivist counter-elite which opposes the rentiers and has a project, a productivist project. And this productivist counter-elite has to seek power and win power, and in power offer to the mass of people who are the subjective petty bourgeoisie an alternative, a different range of options of realizing their aspiration. So that antiquated, archaic, relatively unproductive family business is not the only form which this aspiration for modest prosperity and independence takes. Now, I'm calling it the subjective petty bourgeoisie because, of course, most people aren't really petty bourgeois. It's not that they belong to a small business class. They don't, objectively. But their horizon of aspiration is petty bourgeois. And that's the sense in which I'm calling it a subjective petty bourgeoisie. Now, finally, I said, no project, no way of thinking, no base other than this not yet thinkable or accessible base of the subjective petty bourgeoisie, and no adequate crisis. Now, why crisis? Crisis because up to now in history, in modern history, it's been necessary to have a crisis in order to have transformation. And crisis in two main forms, economic collapse or war. So without a crisis, it seems, under the current dispensation, almost impossible to create anything. Look at the United States. Franklin Roosevelt had the greatest war in modern history and the greatest economic collapse in modern history as his allies. And even then he had trouble because the constitutional framework within which he was working was designed to give him trouble. In Europe, transformation has come in the wake of war. When the Europeans are slaughtering each other, they wake up. And then things happen. And when peace is reestablished, they go back to sleep and drown their sorrows in consumption. This is what the real experience of history has been. So we need a crisis. We don't have the crisis. They could wake everyone up. If we had it, we'd be afraid of it anyway. So we need the institutions that can diminish the dependence of change on crisis. Make crisis less necessary to change. And of course, what the prophet thinks, the political prophet, is that the imagination can at least partly replace the work of crisis. That the imagination can do the work of crisis without crisis. So that's the situation, this predicament. Yes.
Why do you think, oh wow, there's a lot. Why do you think crisis has been so necessary for change, and like what
Why
part
is
of that
crisis
assumption are we
necessary?
challenging? Sorry?
Do you ask why is crisis necessary? Or,
Like why has it been so necessary historically
well,
for
because
change?
I'm not sure at what level or in what form I should answer that, but the assumption is so at one level it's humanity, human nature, right? The poet says, Auden says, writing about babies, they would rather be ruined than changed. But that's who we are. So we don't, transformation has not occurred without crisis. Now we would like experimentalism to flourish, innovation, not under the whip of crisis. But it seems that it's difficult. But now we can go down to a more concrete level and say, the institutions of society can be designed to either increase or diminish the dependence of change on crisis. So the liberals and socialists of the 19th century thought that there was a spontaneous affinity, a convergence between the institutional requirements for the material progress of humanity, economic growth, lifting the burdens of poverty, drudgery, and infirmity that weigh on humanity, and the institutions that could emancipate them, that could make them freer. And now we've become pessimistic. And we're threatened by the opposite dogmatism, which is to think that there's an inevitable tragic contradiction between the institutional requirements of material progress and the institutional requirements of emancipation. The alternative would be to recognize that there's an area of potential overlap, a subset of the institutional requirements of material progress, which also make possible emancipation, and a subset of the institutional conditions of emancipation which promote material progress. And what we would want then would be to travel in that area of overlap, to find that zone of intersection. So, for example, we might say, we want to establish the constitutional arrangements that no longer require crisis to make change possible, to facilitate the amendment procedures for the Constitution, for example, to make the amendment of the Constitution not almost impossible. And that would be an example of diminishing the dependence of change on crisis. So the attempt to diminish the dependence of change on crisis can become an institutional project. But there is, of course, a circularity, because we could say the introduction of these experimentalist institutions that diminish the dependence of change on crisis may itself depend on crisis. And somehow we have to break that circularity. That's what that question leads to. Yes.
Yeah, I have two questions, if that's okay. The first one is, what are your thoughts on how stable institutions have to be to provide some sort of order, which I think might be a little bit at risk in institutions, which, like, if you're imagining what changes take place during crises, I imagine like they could be a little bit less stable if that is your default form of an institution.
You
And
mean because of the fear that experimentalism would lead to constant flux?
Yeah, it would lead to more
constant
change,
conflict.
right? I think, and like, so I'm just curious how you balance this idea of like much more rapidly, it being more rapidly possible to achieve change while needing some sort of stability for a society to be, you know, have some sort of order or consistency.
Well, let me begin with a metaphor to explain it. So, a building which is designed to be in an area susceptible to earthquakes can be designed to be flexible so that it shifts in the wind. And then you could say, well, compare that building to the building which is rigid. Then you could say, which of the two is the one that we want? And seeing that we want the one that can render transformation banal. So transformation, when it comes, doesn't have to be in the form of some big crisis, but can be rendered banal. And then transformation takes the form. That's what we would call experimentalism. Now, take a concrete constitutional example. suppose a presidential regime in which the Congress and the president, the executive, have separate powers. And these regimes, they were initially designed in the United States, when transported to Latin America, turn out to take on a very different color, because in a society with steep class hierarchies and intense conflict, the presidential regime becomes a device by which outsiders can seek power. And then seeking power, they find themselves confronting the elites entrenched in the Congress, in the congressional majority. Now, we might say, for example, we want to preserve the presidential regime in the circumstance I described, because it is a channel by which the outsider can quickly reach the center of power. And if we simply parliamentarize the presidential regime, we will keep power in the hands of the political elites, beholden to the asset-holding class, and will prevent this disruption from the outsider. But then the presidential regime was designed by Madison to perpetuate deadlock. The objective was not to resolve deadlock quickly. It was to perpetuate it in order to inhibit the political transformation of society, because there was supposed to be an order in society which was intimately related to freedom and prosperity, and you wouldn't want that order to be constantly upset. So the logic of the classic presidential regime, as it is designed in the American Constitution, is to perpetuate deadlock rather than to resolve it. But then you could say, well, we want the presidential regime because it's a channel by which the outsider comes to power, but we want to cure it of its Madisonian defect by resolving impasses quickly. And how would we do that? Well, there are a series of devices by which we might do that. For example, we might say that under a presidential regime, both the executive and the legislature would be able to call early elections to resolve the impasse. But the early elections would always have to be bilateral for both branches, so that the branch that exercised the constitutional prerogative of calling the early elections would have to pay the political price of running the electoral risk. Now, that's a concrete example of the problem you raised. Do you suppose that under that arrangement, elections would be called all the time and there would be constant political flux? I think the opposite would be likely to happen, that the prerogative would be rarely exercised. And the reason why it would be rarely exercised is that it would require both branches to seek the confirmation of their power, and they would be reluctant to do that. So I think this question devolves into very tangible issues of institutional design. But now we can answer your question at another level, at a more abstract level. Imagine a spectrum of societies in history. At one pole of the spectrum is a society organized by a scriptural caste order. Not the real caste orders of ancient India, but imagine the extreme, in which the whole security and freedom of the individual is bound up with the detailed form of the perpetuation of his habitual structure of life, the structure of his caste. That's one order. At the opposite pole of this structure, of this range of societies, would be a society in which the security of the individual in the exercise of his vital interests and his autonomy is disentangled as much as it can be from the possession of a particular habitual form of social life. So a concrete example from contemporary issues is the system of flex security in the Netherlands or in the Scandinavian countries, in which the social and labor rights of the individual are disentangled from the possession of a particular job. So our societies can be organized in such a way that freedom doesn't require the rigidification of a whole form of social life. So freedom means two different things at the extremes of the spectrum. Is it part of the rigidification of a collective form of social life, or does it arise as the result of the disengagement of a particular collective form of life from this structure, which is the position that I would defend? And then I would say the contemporary societies are at some middle place in this imaginary spectrum that I described, because their forms, like the classical forms of private property and of contract, are not the natural form of a free society. They're a particular form of the market, which continues in some way to confuse or to entangle these two sides, security with the maintenance of a particular form of life. And our objective should be to disentangle them as much as possible. That would be the discussion we would then have. Yes.
Two questions. How do you define progressive, and why is it practically useful to loop
Well,
liberals and
we're
left?
going to come to that, but let me anticipate it now in response to your question. There's an obvious question in an exploration like this, and part of this confusion. So, in the established ideological debate, there is a contrast between what you could call shallow equality and shallow freedom. So conventionally, the way in which we think about the right is the right are those who accord priority to freedom over equality. And who is the left? The left are those who accord priority to equality. And I call them both shallow, because by shallow I mean the assumption of the preservation of the existing institutional structure. In this case, the structure of the market, a particular kind of market, with a particular apparatus of legal arrangements of private property and free contract. That's the ideological debate in the form in which it now appears in the world. And then I would say, how should we think of the division between right and left? What is the alternative way of thinking of the division between right and left? I would argue for a division based on two criteria. The first criteria has to do with the relation to the existing practices and institutions. The conservatives are those who accept the established regime, the established institutional arrangement, as the horizon of their projects of administration and transformation. So they stop at that horizon. And who are the progressives? The progressives are those who are willing to transgress the frontiers, to cross the frontiers of the established institutions in every sphere. But now an important qualification, not to cross the frontiers in the old Marxist way of the indivisibility thesis, to cross the frontiers under the aegis of the view that every exercise in structural change is in principle fragmentary. That is, we cross the frontier piece by piece, step by step, not substituting one indivisible system for another. The second criterion has to do with the objective. What is it that should distinguish as a goal the progressives from the conservatives? And I would say the following, just by way of introducing a very long discussion. The conservatives are the ones who believe that it is natural for human life to be small. So there is an elite of disruptors, of inventors, of geniuses, who are released from the almost universal decree of belittlement. The masses, the majority of the people, are released from this imperative of belittlement only in certain extreme historical moments, like war. Because then they're all lifted up. Now, we all think war is terrible, but in the Second World War, the most terrible and total war in human history, rates of suicide and depression fell precipitously in all the belligerent powers, including in the Soviet Union, where 23 million people were slaughtered. And so people stopped killing each other, one another. They killed their enemies, of course, but they didn't kill themselves. And they stopped being depressed. And as soon as universal peace was reestablished in the world, suicide and depression rose again. So this is by way of a comment on who we really are, because we're not who we seem to be. And the progressives are the ones who think that we can all become bigger, provided that we become bigger together and rise to a higher form of life with greater scope, more intensity, and higher capabilities. That, I would say, is the alternative view of what distinguishes the progressive from the conservative. And that's, of course, a radical change in the accepted conception of what's a progressive. Now, think of the following. Go back to the accepted theories of distributive justice, like the Rawlsian theory of justice. On their face, they seem to be radically egalitarian, the difference principle in Rawls, for example. But what are they really? Because if someone's project was the transformation of the structure of society, they wouldn't have this kind of distributivist contraption as their intellectual instrument. So it seems that it's a kind of pseudo-philosophical prop to the homely practices of compensatory redistribution under institutionally conservative social democracy. That's what it has meant to be a leftist, to say, we have this market order. We won't reinvent the market in order, for example, to create a knowledge economy for the many. We'll humanize it by progressive taxation and by redistributive social entitlements. So that's what it turns on. So that's a different and then, so on this theory, to present it in a punchy form, the alternative to the contrast between shallow equality and shallow freedom is not deep freedom, deep equality. It's deep freedom because, and this goes to what both the classical liberals and the classical socialists like Marx believed. They weren't radical egalitarians. Of course, they were opposed to entrenched inequalities because entrenched inequalities were burdens on freedom. But what they wanted was for the ordinary human being, the ordinary man and woman, to rise to a higher level, to have a higher life. And the diminishment of inequality was an important secondary feature in this pursuit, but it was not the main goal. So the successor to shallow equality is deep freedom through the transformation of the regime. And that's the contrast between the right and the left, the conservative and the progressive, for which I would want to argue here in this course. Now, sometimes it's thought that the vocabulary of right and left, of progressive and conservative, has lost all meaning. And I agree with this only partly. I think we have to reinvent it. And the reinvention has to be accessory to this attempt to redraw the lines of conflict. Now, of course, this opens a window to a larger set of debates philosophically. Deep freedom. What is it to be free? How are we free? Who is free? And there's a set of contradictions which have to be managed in the defense of freedom. Let's see if I can get the sun out of my eyes. There we are. So it seems to me that there are three fundamental forms of freedom, having now the brief philosophical discussion, which is not what we're mainly going to have in our course. So the first is the domain of the relation between the self and others. No one is free disconnected. We're free connected to others. But every connection to others threatens us with subjugation. And we have a personal experience of connection without subjugation in personal love, especially in a Christian and romantic culture like ours. But that is not available, that's not feasible outside intimacy, among strangers. All we can have among strangers is the altruistic, impersonal benevolence that the moral philosophers offer us as the cold alternative to what we really want. So the real alternative to love in relations among strangers is cooperation. Cooperation is the practical and real alternative. Cooperation among free and equal individuals. But of course, the problem is that all the tangible forms of cooperation are the object of conflict in history. There's no obvious way in which to organize cooperation. Take the market. Even at its most abstract level, the market can be defined as a form of cooperation among strangers that is impossible when there is no trust and unnecessary when there is high trust. So if there's high trust, we don't need a market. And if there's low trust, we can't have a market. If there's a simple absolute division between the stranger and the insider. And next we discover that the different forms of market and the different practices of production differ in the degree to which they depend on and help create higher levels of trust. So, for example, the knowledge economy, the now most advanced practice of production, requires and permits and requires a higher degree of cooperation than the command and control practices of traditional industrialization or traditional corporate control. So that's then the beginning of a debate. That's how we in fact create freedom in that domain. Now take the second domain. The second domain is the relation of self to society. No one can be free without being engaged in a particular social world. But every form of engagement seems to exact from us as the price of engagement submission. Submission to the social order. So how do we become free? We become free to the extent that we can engage without submitting. To the extent that we can participate in a concrete social world, but deny it the last word, keep the last word for ourselves. To the extent that we can do that, we're free. And that then leads, as a practical matter, to the debates about how we can create orders of society and culture that allow us to be insiders and outsiders at the same time. That's freedom. And one of the ways in which we can be insiders and outsiders at the same time is if we create a regime and order that is susceptible to transformation from within, that allows us to amend it, that is experimental about itself. The third domain of freedom is in the relation of the self, not to others and not to society, but to itself. So in order to be free, we have to create a habitual way of being. The Greeks called it character. And they said, character is faith. But as this designation already suggests, we're not free if we create this icon, this mask, and allow it to rigidify and to suck the life out of us. So we're free only if we create the habitual way of being, but find a way at the same time to disrupt it. And that too is freedom. So, and societies and cultures can differ in the extent to which they allow for this experimentation with oneself, They allow for this reinvention of the self. That's freedom. Freedom is the management of those contradictions in those three domains that I just described. And the free society, under the aegis of this idea of deep freedom, is the society that then allows for the advancement of those three projects of the reconstruction of the self. So at this stage, of course, the programmatic debate, our debate in the course about alternatives, turns out into a much larger project of debate about ourselves. Tocqueville said that politics, when it's serious, is also always religious. And that every great revolution is both a political revolution and a religious revolution. And what he meant is that it isn't just a revolution about institutions, but about these ideas. And in particular, in this setting, these ideas of freedom. So that's by way of answering your question. Further comment?
So I have a question in your perspective on how this faction of the elite should engage with other social institutions in order to access the social basis. So for example,
When I was talking about the subjective petty bourgeoisie
yeah,
and the productivist counter-elite. So remember, I just want to be sure that everyone remembers the context
perfect,
from
yeah.
which your question was drawn. My assumption was that all the societies in the world are class societies, and there's not going to be any transformation, any fundamental transformation, unless some faction of the elites is part of it. And thus the need in many of the societies in the world for there to arise alongside the predominant element in the elite, which is characteristically some form of rentier, a productivist counter-elite, which then has the project of enhancing national power and prosperity. And this productivist counter-elite then, I said, would have to approach the majority, who are the subjective petty bourgeoisie, and offer them an alternative to their regressive, archaic, relatively unproductive object of charm, of seduction, which is isolated, archaic family business. For example, by some position in the emerging knowledge economy. So we have to think the knowledge economy is not just some fancy bunch of entrepreneurs and technologists in Silicon Valley. It has to do with the elevation of productivity in every sector of the economy. And it requires this marriage of nature and mind. Yes, go on.
And in that sense, when we had, for example, the organized labor, we had the unions as a way of mediating the access of these elites to the social base. Nowadays, with the petty bourgeoisie, I can see, for example, evangelical churches with the theology of prosperity. So how should the elites engage with, or should they engage with these social institutions to actually get the message across this new social base?
Well, how are you using the example of the evangelicals? Are you counting them as part of the elites?
Not necessarily. I see them as a social institution that nowadays have a huge penetration towards this petty bourgeoisie.
Absolutely. So this is what we have in Latin America. Enormous influence of this evangelical movement, and they do have an idea of emancipation. For the idea is often harnessed, kidnapped by market fundamentalism and right-wing ideologies, but it's capable of evolving in another direction. But what are you asking then about that?
Yeah, my question is whether the progressive can present this alternative, because nowadays, as you said, it's being pretty much kidnapped by the market forces and the right.
Of course they can present an alternative, but that's a theological operation, right, also. It's not just a form of political sagacity. So Christianity as a religion certainly is open to this idea. A fundamental conception in Christianity is the conception of embodied spirit. So the individual, made in the image of God, is the infinite. And the infinite is imprisoned in the finite, is caught in the finite. And so it can be lifted up. The narrow idea of a theology of prosperity is a trivialization or a corruption of this larger idea of spiritual emancipation, which is, of course, one of the dimensions or expressions of the deep freedom. So let me then, in the closing minutes of our class, just say that this whole exploration of alternatives takes place in two main dimensions. First, in the short term. The situation in the world, which we're going to be discussing in the course. Collapse of allegiance to the center-right and center-left parties. This floating mass, especially the subjective petty bourgeoisie, as I called it. And the rise of plutocratic authoritarian populism in many countries around the world, which on the whole has no project. Aside from the restraints on immigration, its project is, to a large extent, the conservative social democratic project. Subsidies to traditional mass production, to extend its life a few more years through subsidies or through protectionism, even though we know that it's gone and it's not coming back. And the strengthening of executive authority without fundamental constitutional provision. So there's this short-term horizon, which is the context of most of our programmatic debates in the course. But there's also a longer-term horizon, which is in the background. And the longer-term horizon is that for 200 or 300 years, the world has been on fire. It is a revolutionary period in the history of humanity. And this revolutionary period remains the commanding project in the world, even though it has many enemies. It continues to command the agenda because all of its enemies respond to it. This revolutionary project has two sides. One side, the side which will especially occupy us here, is the institutional side, the organization of society. It has promised to lift the burden of oppressive hierarchical structures weighing on humanity through its characteristic doctrines of democracy, liberalism, and socialism. And the other side of this revolutionary project is personalist. And it is carried especially by the Romantic movement and the worldwide Romantic culture, disseminating throughout the world this message that the ordinary man and woman is not so ordinary after all, and is capable of rising to a higher level. Now, the revolutionary project is then in a paradoxical situation. It is weakened. It is weakened, and it's weakened mainly because its defenders, both on the political or institutional side and on the personal side, no longer know what its next steps should be. That was the starting point today of my discussion. They have no project. And the same thing could be said on the moral side. The Romantic movement, the worldwide Romantic culture. But it nevertheless remains the commanding project. For it to continue living, for the revolution to keep burning, to keep going on, be necessary to reinvent it. In its content, in its message, and in its methods, in its form. That's the larger framework. Now, and that's the situation in which I see myself intervening, thinking of the historical circumstance that we share. I see myself, because I'm hopeful, as having been born in a counter-revolutionary interlude in this long revolutionary period in the history of humanity. I say counter-revolutionary interlude because, of course, I hope they will be overcome so that the revolution can continue. But the only way in which the revolution can continue is if we renounce it and reinvent it. That's the law of the spirit. What we want to possess, we have to give up and reinvent. And that then is the real object, with this idea of freedom as the inspiration, the real object. Now, I should say one more thing about my method. I'm going to be arguing with you in the course of the semester about a particular alternative. I'm not going to be pretending that there's some array of alternatives and that we by induction will open a path. I'm going to defend a particular one. And one of my reasons, now, I don't want that to be mistaken for some kind of indoctrination. I don't hope, expect, or want any of you to be persuaded by the particular alternatives that I defend. But the problem the enormous problem that we have is that, on the whole, no one believes in anything. And we're not going to be able to have a discussion about alternatives unless a particular alternative is presented. And then we can argue about it from every side. So that's the spirit. So I will, seeing myself as I see myself surrounded by this ocean of nihilism, of skepticism, of disbelief, I will vigorously defend an alternative. And I want you to fight back, because that's the only way in which we can have a discussion. We can't have a discussion pretending all to be agnostics about the alternative before humanity. Thank you for your patience.
I'm good. How are you? Thank you for the class. I'm Tyler. I'm an HKS student. I had a question about your characterization of the knowledge economy as being islands of separate, sort of small.
No, islands in the following. The knowledge economy is multi-sector. Unlike mass production, it exists in every sector. Knowledge-intensive services,